It all started as a quirk, a harmless, quirky little thing. Emily had always been into true crime shows, podcasts, and dramas about messy affairs. I used to tease her about how much time she spent devouring salacious stories of deception and betrayal. "You're like a detective without a case," I'd joke, and she'd laugh, winking as she promised to solve the next neighborhood mystery. When she started paying attention to the local gossip, I didn't think much of it. Every community has its share of rumors, and ours was no exception. Neighbors whispering over hedges, the subtle raising of eyebrows when someone's husband worked too many late nights. It was the soundtrack of suburban life. Emily joked about playing detective, speculating who might be cheating on who, but it seemed harmless. Just her way of adding a little excitement to the monotony. Then came that night. I was rummaging through her home office, looking for a spare phone charger. I never spent much time in there. It was her space, a sanctuary for her hobbies. But as I opened a drawer, my eyes landed on the corkboard mounted on the far wall, illuminated by her desk lamp. At first, I thought it was some kind of art project. Then I stepped closer, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The board was covered with photos of our neighbors, arranged in a grid-like pattern. Each photo had colored yarn connecting it to others, crisscrossing in an intricate web. Sticky notes were tacked onto several of the photos with scrawled notes like "late night visitor" and "texting habits changed." It was the kind of setup you'd expect to see in a police drama, not in your wife's home office. My eyes scanned the board, moving from one neighbor to the next, until they landed on Clara. Clara lived 2 houses down, a friendly enough woman who occasionally joined us for barbecues. What made my stomach twist wasn't her photo, it was the red line connecting it to mine. Underneath my picture, Emily had scribbled "schedule matches Clara's movements" and "possibly discreet." I stared at the board, my mind racing. What the hell was this? Why was I even on this thing? It felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. A strange sensation of being accused, of what, I wasn't sure, crept over me. I took a step back, my hands clenching in a fist as I tried to steady my breathing. When Emily came upstairs a few minutes later, she found me still standing there, staring at the board. "Oh," she said casually, as if I discovered nothing more than an unfinished craft project. "What is this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Oh, come on," she replied, waving a hand dismissively. "It's just a fun little project. You know how I love solving puzzles." "Fun?" I snapped, pointing to my photo. "Why the hell am I on this? And why is there a line connecting me to Clara?" Emily's face froze for a moment, her smile faltering. "It's not serious," she said after a beat. "I was just piecing things together. It doesn't mean anything. You know I'm into this stuff." "You're into this stuff?" I repeated, disbelief dripping from my words. "Emily, you have a conspiracy board with our neighbors on it. Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" She crossed her arms defensively, her gaze darting away. "It's just a game," she insisted. "I don't believe any of it. I just like piecing the clues together." Her tone was defensive, but there was something else there, something evasive. She wasn't meeting my eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me the whole truth. "Emily," I said, my voice lowering, "this isn't normal. You've got notes about people's private lives, photos, speculations. And me? Connected to Clara? What are you even implying?" She let out a frustrated sigh. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. It's not like I'm spying on anyone. People talk, okay? I just organize the information." Her words didn't sit right with me. The nonchalance, the defensiveness, it was like she was trying to make me feel guilty for questioning her. "Look," she said, brushing past me and pulling a sticky note off the board. "See this? Suspicious text behavior. That came from Clara herself at the last barbecue. She was tipsy and said something about how Jake, her husband, was acting weird with his phone. This isn't some crazy thing I made up." "And me?" I asked, gesturing to my picture. "How do I fit into this harmless project of yours?" Emily hesitated, then forced a laugh. "It's just speculation. Like, if I didn't know you were loyal, who might you match up with? That's all." Her explanation didn't ease my mind. It only raised more questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying the scene in my head, staring at the ceiling as Emily slept soundly beside me. Why the hell was I on that board? And what was she really up to? The shift from unease to full-blown dread started about a week after I discovered the board. It was a Saturday morning when Emily burst into the kitchen, grinning like she'd just uncovered the biggest scoop of the century. "Jake and Sophia had a massive fight last night," she said, practically bouncing on her heels. "Sophia found another woman's bra under their bed." I stared at her, still groggy from sleep. "What? How do you even know that?" "Are you kidding?" The whole neighborhood's talking about it, she replied, grabbing her phone and scrolling through the local community group chat. Sure enough, someone had posted a cryptic message about unfortunate drama at Jake and Sophia's house, followed by a dozen thinly veiled comments speculating about infidelity. Emily, however, wasn't just speculating, she was reveling in it. See, she said, smirking as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I told you something was off with Jake. My board doesn't lie. Her words hit me like a gut punch. The board. I hadn't been able to stop thinking about it since I found it, but I tried to brush off her obsession as just that, an obsession. Now, though, her smugness made my skin crawl. Emily, I said cautiously, you don't really think Jake planted someone else's bra under their bed, do you? That doesn't even make sense. She shrugged, sipping her coffee. Maybe he was careless. Men always get sloppy eventually, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. Jake didn't strike me as the type to cheat. He was a bit reserved, maybe even a little boring, but infidelity? It didn't fit. And Sophia, when I'd seen her in passing that morning, she wasn't angry. She looked devastated, like her world had crumbled overnight. Later that evening, while Emily was in the shower, I found myself standing in her office again. The court board was still there, untouched, but this time I wasn't looking at the photos or the yarn connections. I was looking for something else, anything to confirm the nagging feeling in my gut. I started opening drawers, sifting through papers, sticky notes, and receipts. Most of it seemed harmless enough until I found a crumpled receipt shoved to the back of the bottom drawer. It was from a lingerie store, dated 2 days earlier. The item listed? A bra in the exact same brand and size that Sophia had supposedly found. My heart dropped. I felt like the floor beneath me had vanished. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Emily had bought that bra. When she came out of the shower, I confronted her. I didn't bother easing into it. Did you plant that bra at Jake and Sophia's house? She froze mid-step, the towel still wrapped around her hair. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. Emily, I snapped, holding up the receipt. This. The bra. Did you plant it? For a moment, she just stared at me, her face unreadable. Then, to my absolute disbelief, she smiled. Okay, she said, her voice calm, almost amused. Yes, I planted it, but don't act like it's a big deal. It's not like I hurt anyone. Not a big deal? I repeated, my voice rising. You sabotaged their marriage. Do you even realize what you've done? I didn't sabotage anything, she shot back, her tone defensive now. I just gave Sophia a nudge to see the truth. The truth? I was incredulous. Emily, you created the evidence. Jake wasn't cheating. Her face darkened and she crossed her arms. You don't know that. Men like Jake always have something to hide. I just sped up the inevitable. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Do you even hear yourself? You've turned someone's life into one of your sick little games. It's not a game, she snapped, her voice trembling now. It's about proving I'm not crazy. You said my board was insane, but it works. It's accurate. Accurate? I shouted, holding up the receipt again. This isn't accuracy, Emily. This is manipulation. It's sick. She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw tight. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. I did it for the greater good, to expose the truth. I demanded that she confess, tell Sophia and Jake the truth about what she'd done. But Emily wouldn't budge. She insisted she'd done nothing wrong, that she was simply helping people see what was already there. That night, I slept on the couch. Or at least I tried to. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Sophia's tear-streaked face, Jake's confused protests, and Emily's smug satisfaction over breakfast. The woman I married wasn't just obsessed. She was dangerous. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever really known her at all. I didn't think Emily would actually do it. For days, I begged her to confess to Jake and Sophia about what she'd done, but she stonewalled me every time. You're overreacting, she'd say. It's not like they're going to get divorced over one stupid bra. But I knew better. The guilt gnawed at me, and I couldn't let her bury this. Finally, I gave her an ultimatum. Confess, or I'd do it for her. The confrontation was a train wreck. Emily marched over to Jake and Sophia's house, her face a mask of defiance, while I lingered awkwardly on the sidewalk. She told them everything, or rather, her version of everything. She spun the story to make it seem like she was doing them a favor, framing herself as some kind of truth seeker who simply got carried away. Sophia was livid, understandably so. Jake looked like he was stuck between disbelief and outright fury. Do you realize what you've done to us? Sophia demanded, tears streaming down her face. Emily stood there stiffly, arms crossed, refusing to apologize. "I was just trying to help," she muttered, as if that absolved her of all wrongdoing. After what felt like hours of shouting, Emily stormed off, leaving me behind to deal with the fallout. I tried to explain, to apologize on her behalf, but the damage was done. Sophia didn't want to hear it. Jake barely looked at me. As I walked home alone, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. The neighborhood was a pressure cooker after that. Jake and Sophia eventually worked things out, but they avoided us like the plague. The whispers started almost immediately, neighbors gossiping over fences, giving us side eyes during grocery runs. Emily, once so eager to chat with everyone on the block, became a recluse. She claimed she was the victim of a smear campaign. "They're just mad because I uncovered the truth," she said bitterly one afternoon, peering out the blinds like she expected a mob with pitchforks. "People don't like being exposed." "You didn't expose anything," I snapped, unable to hide my frustration. "You made it up. There's a difference." Her eyes narrowed. "You're supposed to be on my side," she said coldly. And just like that, the conversation was over. Our marriage was crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. I started sleeping in the guest room, not because we were arguing, but because I didn't feel safe. Emily's behavior had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. The board, the lies, the manipulation, it all painted a picture of someone I barely recognized. She was still obsessed with her board, though she insisted she was taking a break from the neighbors. But I'd catch her in her office late at night, muttering to herself as she rearranged photos and notes. When I tried to bring up therapy, she lashed out, accusing me of treating her like she was crazy. "You're the one who's blind," she said. "You don't see the bigger picture." I started avoiding her as much as I could. Work became my refuge, and I stayed late most nights just to put some distance between us. When I was home, I barely spoke to her. The silence between us was suffocating, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap. Then one evening, Emily dropped a bombshell. "I'm pregnant," she announced over dinner, her voice soft but steady. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What?" She smiled nervously, reaching in her bag and pulling out a positive pregnancy test. "I wasn't sure how to tell you. I know things have been hard, but maybe this is what we need." I stared at the test, my emotions a tangled mess of shock, confusion, and was that hope? Things between us had been so strained that I hadn't even considered the possibility of this happening. But now, staring at that little plastic stick, I felt a flicker of optimism. "Are you sure?" I asked cautiously. Emily nodded, her smile widening. "I took 2 tests, both positive. I know it's a lot to take in, but maybe this is a sign. A chance to start fresh." Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that this could be the thing that pulled us out of the spiral we'd been stuck in. But another part of me couldn't shake the doubt creeping into my mind. After everything that had happened, the lies, the manipulation, I couldn't help but wonder, was this real? Or just another one of Emily's games? For the first time in months, things felt normal. After Emily told me she was pregnant, a strange calm seemed to settle over her. She stopped obsessing over the board, stopped muttering to herself late at night, and started focusing on the future. She talked about nursery designs, baby names, and whether we should repaint the spare room. "I think pale yellow," she said one afternoon, holding up paint swatches. "It's gender neutral but still cheerful." I nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm. Truth be told, I was still grappling with the news. I wanted to believe this was a fresh start, a way to move past everything that had happened. But a gnawing doubt lingered in the back of my mind, one I couldn't quite shake. Emily even made an effort to apologize for her past actions, at least superficially. "I know I've been difficult," she said one night as we lay in bed. "I just got carried away. But I promise, I'm letting it go. For the baby, for us." Her words felt rehearsed, but I nodded anyway. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. As the weeks went on, though, small inconsistencies began to pile up. Emily never scheduled a doctor's appointment, despite my repeated reminders. "I'll do it tomorrow," she'd say, brushing me off. Or, "They're all booked up right now, but I'm on a wait list." Her excuses became increasingly flimsy. One day, she claimed she'd already gone to a clinic while I was at work, but when I asked for details, she grew defensive. "Why do you need to know everything?" she snapped. "I'm handling it." The more I pressed, the more evasive she became. Something wasn't adding up, and the doubt I'd been trying to suppress started bubbling to the surface. Then, one night, I found her laptop open on the kitchen counter. She'd stepped out to take a phone call, and curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see her usual Pinterest boards for nursery ideas. Instead, Her search history stopped me cold. Fake positive pregnancy tests. How to make a pregnancy test show positive. Photos of positive pregnancy tests. My hand started to shake as I scrolled through the tabs she'd left open. One of them was a site selling counterfeit pregnancy tests, complete with glowing customer reviews about how convincing they were. Another was a collection of stock images featuring positive test results. My heart sank. It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The pregnancy, the hope I dared to feel. It was all a lie. When Emily walked back into the kitchen, I was still standing there, holding her laptop. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. She froze, her face going pale. "What are you doing on my laptop?" "Don't even try to deflect," I snapped, shoving the screen toward her. "Fake pregnancy tests? Photos? What is this, Emily?" For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, to my shock, she started crying big, heaving sobs that made her shoulders shake. "I just wanted to fix us," she choked out, sinking into a chair. "I thought if we had a baby, you'd stay." I stared at her, my anger battling with a wave of cold, sinking dread. "You lied," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You made me believe." "I didn't know what else to do," she cried, burying her face in her hands. Everything was falling apart, and I thought this would bring us back together. Her sobs filled the kitchen, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I didn't even know how to process what she was saying. She'd faked an entire pregnancy, not just to manipulate me, but to hold our crumbling marriage together. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I asked, my voice breaking. "You can't just lie about something like this. You've crossed a line, Emily." Again, she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "I just wanted us to be okay." But we weren't okay. We hadn't been okay for a long time, and now I wasn't sure we ever would be. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Emily's actions weren't just impulsive or misguided. They were deeply troubling. This wasn't just about the board or the bra anymore. This was something darker, something deeper. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was out of my depth. Emily wasn't just acting irrationally. She needed help, real professional help. But even as that thought took root, I couldn't ignore the gnawing question in the back of my mind. Was it already too late? After the pregnancy lie came crashing down, I thought Emily might finally hit rock bottom. That maybe, just maybe, she'd take a step back and realize how far off the rails her behavior had gone. But I was wrong. It was as if the collapse of her lie had stripped away the last thread of stability, and what came next was worse than anything I could have imagined. The accusation started a few days later. It was subtle at first, side comments, pointed questions, little digs about my time at work, or passing remarks about Clara. Then one evening, she exploded. "I know you've been seeing her," Emily shouted as I walked into the kitchen. She was standing by the counter, clutching her phone, her face flushed with rage. "Seeing who?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Clara," she snapped. "Don't act dumb, John. The board doesn't lie. You've been sneaking around with her, haven't you?" For a moment, I just stared at her, stunned. "Emily, are you serious right now? Clara is our neighbor." I barely say more than hi to her. "Don't lie to me," she screamed, slamming her phone onto the counter. "I've seen the way you look at her, and she's always outside when you come home from work. Don't think I haven't noticed." I tried to keep my voice calm, but my patience was wearing thin. "Emily, you're making this up. None of this is real. You need to stop." Her face twisted with anger, and she stormed out of the room. I thought that would be the end of it, but I underestimated just how far she was willing to go. The next day, I came home from work to find Clara standing on her porch, arms crossed, with her husband, Greg, looking equally bewildered. As I walked up the driveway, I realized Emily was there too, on their front lawn, yelling loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "She's been sleeping with my husband," Emily shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Clara. "Ask her. She won't deny it because she can't." Clara's jaw dropped. "What the hell are you talking about?" she fired back, looking at me as if I could somehow explain this madness. "Emily, stop," I said, my voice shaking with embarrassment and anger. "This is insane. Go home." She spun around to face me, her eyes wild. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me, John. I've seen the proof." "What proof?" Greg finally snapped, stepping forward. "You're out of your mind. Get off our property." The neighbors were gathering now, peering out of windows and stepping onto their porches to watch the spectacle unfold. My face burned with humiliation. I grabbed Emily's arm, firmly but carefully, and tried to pull her away. "We're leaving. Now, she shook me off, glaring at Clara one last time before finally storming back to our house. I followed her, trying to ignore the burning stares of the neighborhood. Inside, I slammed the door and rounded on her. What the hell was that? I demanded. You just humiliated me in front of everyone. You've completely lost it. Emily didn't even flinch. They deserved it, she said flatly. She's been messing with our marriage, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I was speechless. There was no reasoning with her anymore. Emily's paranoia spiraled out of control after that. She started staying up late again, working obsessively on her board. But now it wasn't just the neighbor she was tracking, it was me. She scribbled down my work schedule, receipts from the grocery store, even times when I left the house to walk the dog. One night, I heard her muttering to herself in her office. I peeked inside to find her standing in front of the board, adding a new sticky note under my picture. It read, "Possible lies about work hours." I tried to talk to her about therapy again, but she refused, accusing me of trying to make her seem crazy. "You just want to silence me because I'm close to the truth," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You're the liar here, John. I've seen the way you look at her." Her words were like a slap to the face. She wasn't just lashing out. She truly believed her own delusions. The final straw came one night when I woke up to find Emily standing over me. She was holding her phone, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. My heart leapt into my throat. "Emily," I said cautiously, "what are you doing?" "I'm gathering evidence," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "Evidence of what?" I asked, sitting up in bed. "Of you," she said simply. I stared at her, my mind racing. "Emily, this has to stop. You need help?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't tell her where I was going, just that I needed space. I stayed with a friend for a few nights, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was watching, waiting, plotting her next move. I loved her once, but the woman I married was gone. All that was left was the wreckage of her obsession. And as much as it broke my heart, I knew I couldn't save her. Not from this. Not from herself. A week after I left, I was sitting on my friend's couch, nursing a beer and trying to figure out what the hell my life had become. That's when my phone buzzed. It was Emily. I hesitated before answering. "Hello, John." Her voice was trembling raw. I need to tell you something." There was a long pause, and then the dam broke. She was sobbing, barely able to get the words out. I'm in the hospital. They said I had a breakdown." "What happened?" I asked, sitting up straight. She took a shaky breath and explained. Her co-workers had found her in the break room, crying uncontrollably and claiming that one of our neighbors was following her. She said she could see it all, a web of connections, people conspiring against her. The intensity of her accusations scared them enough to call an ambulance. "I didn't want to go," she said, her voice breaking. "But they made me. They said I wasn't safe." The next part hit me like a punch to the gut. After a series of evaluations, the doctors diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia. They believe her obsession with the board, the accusations, and even the pregnancy lie were manifestations of delusions fueled by her illness. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt relieved. Finally, there was an explanation for everything. But that relief was tangled up in guilt. Had I missed the signs? Could I have stopped this sooner? The first time I visited Emily in the hospital, I barely recognized her. She was sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the courtyard. Her once vivid energy was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. "Hi, Emily," I said softly, stepping into the room. She turned to look at me, her eyes glassy from the medication. "John," she said, her lips curling into a weak smile. "You came." Her voice was slow, almost monotone. It felt like she was swimming through molasses just to speak. "Of course I came," I said, sitting down across from her. For a few minutes, we made small talk. How she was feeling, how her parents were managing, but it felt hollow. She seemed disconnected, like a shell of the woman I'd married. Then, out of nowhere, she leaned forward and whispered, "Have you seen the patterns?" "The patterns?" I repeated, confused. "In the neighborhood," she said, her eyes lighting up with a faint spark of the old Emily. "They're still there, John. You just have to look closely. The board, it's all connected." My heart sank. Even in her medicated state, the obsession still lingered. I tried to steer the conversation away, but she kept circling back to it, asking if I'd been paying attention, if I'd noticed anything suspicious. Each visit was the same. Emily would be calm, sometimes even lucid, but the board always came up. She asked if I'd kept it, if I'd added to it, if anyone in the neighborhood had been exposed. I didn't have the heart to tell her I'd taken it down the day I left. "It's okay if you didn't keep it," she said one day, her tone eerily soothing. "The truth always comes out. You just have to know where to look." It broke my heart to see her like this. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, felt like a stranger now. I wanted to blame the illness, to tell myself that this wasn't her fault, but it didn't make the damage any less real. Emily's doctors told me she was responding well to treatment, that her paranoia was starting to subside. But the progress was slow, and they couldn't say for certain if she'd ever fully recover. One day, as I was leaving, she grabbed my hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes locked onto mine with a desperate intensity. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." I nodded, unable to find the words. "Get better, Emily," I said. "That's all that matters now." But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Emily I knew was already gone. All that was left were the fragments of a life we'd built together, shattered beyond repair. Emily had been in the hospital for about a month when I decided it was time to clean out her office. It wasn't just about tidying up. It was a way to start reclaiming some sense of normalcy. The room had been untouched since the night I left, and I dreaded stepping inside. The corkboard, stripped of its photos and yarn connections, still hung on the wall, a ghostly reminder of how far things had spiraled. I started with the desk drawers, tossing out stray papers and empty pens. At first, it was all mundane. Old receipts, junk mail, a few notebooks filled with grocery lists and half-finished doodles. But in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of blank paper, I found a plain manila folder. I opened it, expecting more notes about our neighbors, but what I found stopped me cold. The photos, scribbled notes, and timelines, they weren't about the neighborhood. They were about me. The first page was a handwritten schedule of my daily routine. It was eerily accurate, down to the time I left for work, my usual lunch breaks, and when I got home. Next to each entry, she'd written notes like, "Was he really at work?" and "Late again." "Excuse?" There were copies of receipts, some crumpled, some pristine, that I didn't even know she'd kept. A gas station charge from 2 months ago. A grocery store receipt from a late-night beer run. She'd circled the times, scrawling question marks and phrases like "alibi doesn't match." My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages. There were photos, too. Most were innocuous. Me mowing the lawn, walking the dog, grabbing the mail. But one photo stood out. It was me talking to Clara. I remembered the moment clearly. It was a few weeks before the bra incident, and she'd asked me about a landscaping service she was thinking of hiring. The conversation had lasted all of 3 minutes, but Emily had captured it from an angle that made it look far more intimate than it was. Scrawled beneath the photo in red ink were the words, "Too friendly." The last note in the folder, written in Emily's meticulous handwriting, chilled me to my core. It said, "Does he know about Clara's past?" I stared at it, my heart pounding. What the hell did that mean? I spent the rest of the afternoon digging. I called a couple of mutual friends, subtly asking if they knew anything about Clara's background. I even scrolled through old posts in the neighborhood Facebook group, looking for anything that might explain the note. Finally, I found it. Clara had been involved in a scandal at her previous job. She'd had an affair with her boss, a married man, which eventually led to a messy lawsuit. The details were murky, but the gossip suggested she'd been fired as part of a settlement. It was old news, buried deep enough that I'd never heard about it. But somehow, Emily had uncovered it. Suddenly, it all made sense. The red string connecting Clara to me, the bra under Jake's bed, the accusations. Emily must have latched onto Clara's past as proof that she was capable of seduction or deceit. To Emily, Clara's history wasn't just gossip. It was damning evidence that fit perfectly into her narrative. But as I sat there, piecing it all together, a darker realization set in. This wasn't just a symptom of Emily's illness. It was deliberate, calculated. Even in her delusions, she'd gone out of her way to gather evidence and manipulate the situation to fit her theories. I didn't know what to feel. Betrayed? Terrified? A twisted combination of both? Emily wasn't just paranoid. She was methodical, even in her madness. That night, I couldn't shake the image of her sitting at her desk, meticulously logging my every move. How long had she been doing this? How much of my life had she scrutinized, distorted, and filed away as proof? I thought back to her accusations about Clara and realized she truly believed she was uncovering the truth. To her, this wasn't a game or a hobby. It was a mission. And as much as I wanted to blame her illness, I couldn't ignore the darker question gnawing at the edges of my mind. Was this who she'd always been, or had the illness simply brought it to the surface? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the woman I'd once trusted more than anyone had turned my life into a case study, and I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again. Emily was discharged from the hospital a few months later, and while her doctor said she was stable enough to leave, I had my doubts. She moved in with her parents, who insisted they'd keep a close eye on her while she continued therapy and medication. When I went to see her for the first time post-discharge, it was like visiting a ghost. Her once sharp features were dulled by the meds, her movements sluggish and deliberate. She greeted me with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for everything that had happened. "I'm sorry," she said quietly as we sat in her parents' living room. "For everything. For the board, for the neighbors, and the baby. The baby." The lie that had almost pulled me back into her orbit. Hearing her bring it up again made my skin crawl. "Do you even remember doing it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on her hands. "Not really. It's all kind of blurry now." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But a part of me couldn't let go of the suspicion that she remembered more than she was letting on. That she'd known exactly what she was doing when she showed me that fake test. A few weeks later, I stopped by her parents' house again, mostly out of obligation. Her parents were kind people, but they'd always been a little too optimistic about Emily's ability to recover. They talked about her as if she was just going through a rough patch, like this was something she'd eventually snap out of. "She's doing so much better," her mom told me that evening. "She's calmer now, more herself. I really think the therapy is helping." But when Emily came into the room, I saw the same flicker in her eyes that had always unnerved me. The one that told me she wasn't entirely tethered to reality. We talked for a while, small talk mostly, until her parents left us alone to make tea in the kitchen. That's when she brought it up again. "I'll do better next time," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Emily's lips curved into a soft smile, but there was something unsettling about it. "The baby. I'll do better next time." My chest tightened. "Emily, there's not going to be a next time. You can't lie about something like that again." She tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "It wasn't about lying," she said slowly. "It was about us. About fixing things." "You can't fix things with lies," I said firmly, trying to keep my frustration in check. "That's not how this works." She just smiled again, her eyes distant. "You'll see," she murmured, almost to herself. Her parents insisted she was doing better, but I wasn't convinced. Her apologies felt hollow, like she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear. And her fixation on the baby, even after everything that had happened, made it clear that her priorities hadn't shifted. One night, I stayed late, helping her dad with a broken faucet in the kitchen. When I passed by her room on my way out, I caught a glimpse of her sitting on her bed, flipping through a baby name book. "Emily?" I said cautiously, stepping into the doorway. She looked up, startled, and quickly closed the book. "Just something to pass the time," she said, her tone overly casual. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. Deep down, I knew she wasn't just reading for fun. She was still planning, still plotting. Her parents refused to see it, brushing off my concerns as paranoia. "She's adjusting," her mom said one day when I brought it up. "You just need to give her time." But time wasn't the issue. Emily's obsession with the baby, with fixing our marriage, was still simmering beneath the surface. And no amount of medication or therapy seemed to be enough to extinguish it. I drove home that night with a knot in my stomach, knowing that as much as I wanted to move on, Emily wasn't ready to let go. And deep down, I wasn't sure she ever would be. Even though Emily was gone, it felt like her shadow stretched across every corner of the neighborhood. The morning after Clara and her husband's moving truck pulled away, I stood at the window, staring at their empty driveway. I wasn't surprised they left. After everything Emily had put them through, the accusations, the spectacle in their yard, I couldn't blame them. But their departure still hit like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the damage Emily had caused. The neighborhood's unspoken rules had shifted. People who once waved cheerfully now avoided eye contact when I walked by. Some looked at me with pity, others with barely concealed judgment. The community events I used to enjoy, barbecues, holiday parties, the occasional poker night at Jake's, had stopped including me. Invitations disappeared, and I stopped trying to explain myself. I couldn't blame them. Emily's paranoia had made everyone a suspect, her lies unraveling the trust we'd all taken for granted. It didn't matter that she was gone, or that I'd tried to distance myself from her actions. In their eyes, I was complicit, even if only by association. Coming home was the hardest part. The house felt heavy, like the walls were holding on to memories I wanted to forget. Emily's office door remained closed, though I knew the board was long gone. I'd torn it down in a fit of anger shortly after she was admitted to the hospital, but I could still picture it perfectly. Photos, notes, yarn crisscrossing like spiderwebs. Sometimes I caught myself staring at the blank wall where it used to hang, half expecting to see her handwriting scrawled in the margins or a new sticky note accusing me of something absurd. The lies she spun, the accusations, the fake pregnancy. It was like the house itself had absorbed the chaos. I thought about selling, starting fresh somewhere else, but the process felt exhausting. And truthfully, I wasn't sure where I'd go. The isolation wore on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jake and Sophia, who'd been close friends once, didn't exactly cut me off, but they made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. Jake barely said 2 words to me when we passed each other on the street, and Sophia wouldn't even look in my direction. One night, I saw Jake hosting a poker game through their living room window. A group of neighbors sat around the table, laughing, beers in hand. I used to be part of that group. I stood there for a moment, watching through the glass, before turning away and heading back inside. Every attempt to reconnect with the neighborhood felt like swimming against the tide. No matter how much time passed, the stigma of Emily's actions clung to me like smoke from a fire I hadn't started but couldn't extinguish. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts and volunteering for projects that kept me out of the house as much as possible. But even that wasn't enough to quiet the noise in my head. The weight of everything, the lies, the fallout, the loneliness, hung over me like a storm cloud. Some nights, I found myself replaying conversations with Emily, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had gone wrong. Was it the first time she joked about investigating the neighbors? The day she bought the corkboard? Or had it started even earlier, long before I noticed the cracks in our life together? The questions were endless, but the answers never came. All I knew was that the woman I married had turned our lives into a wreckage I couldn't seem to escape, no matter how far I tried to distance myself. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I saw one of the new families moving into Clara's old house. They were young, cheerful, waving at passersby as they unloaded boxes. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the chaos that had unfolded here, but I kept walking. Let them have their fresh start. God knows I'd never get mine. For better or worse, this was my life now. An island of one, surrounded by a neighborhood that had long since turned its back on me. Filing for divorce was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. It wasn't just the act of ending the marriage. It was the acknowledgement that the life Emily and I had built was irreparably broken. Every step of the process felt heavy, like I was betraying the woman I had once promised to stand by. But the truth was, that woman no longer existed, and I wasn't sure if she ever had. Emily's treatment continued, and her parents kept me updated sporadically. They said she was stabilizing, that the therapy and medication were helping her see reality more clearly. But even in their optimism, there was an undercurrent of doubt. They knew, as I did, that some things couldn't be undone. I visited her one last time before finalizing the paperwork. She looked better, clearer somehow, but there was still a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before all this. "I heard you're filing," she said softly, her hands folded in her lap. "I am," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I can't say I blame you." Her words stung more than I expected. "This isn't what I wanted," I said, struggling to find the right words. "But I can't live like this anymore." She looked at me for a long moment, then gave a small, sad smile. "Neither can I." Some nights, I find myself thinking about Emily before the board, before the lies and accusations. I think about the woman who used to curl up next to me on the couch, binge-watching crime dramas and cracking jokes about how she'd make a terrible detective. Was that the real Emily? Or was her obsession always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to take over? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers. The divorce felt like closing a chapter, but the truth is it didn't bring the closure I hoped for. The shadow of Emily's actions still lingers, especially in the neighborhood. The occasional piece of gossip or a chance encounter with a neighbor reminds me of how deeply her board poisoned everything. Jake and Sophia are polite when we cross paths, but there's an unspoken tension that never fully dissipates. The new family in Clara's old house has started hosting barbecues, and sometimes I hear the faint sound of laughter drifting down the street. It's like life is moving on for everyone but me. For now, I'm focused on moving forward, though I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. I've started looking for jobs in other cities, hoping a change of scenery will help me rebuild. But even as I make plans, I can't help but feel tethered to this place, to the wreckage Emily left behind. Every once in a while, I'll catch a glimpse of something, a neighbor whispering behind their hand, an unfamiliar car parked on the street, and my heart skips a beat, as if the board might still be alive somewhere. I know it's irrational. Emily isn't here, and the board is long gone. But the paranoia has seeped into me, too, a lingering reminder of how easily everything can unravel. Maybe one day, I'll be able to let it go. But for now, the shadow of Emily's board follows me, a quiet, constant presence that I can't quite escape.